Hello, and thank you for having me here today. You've heard about technologies that strengthen the weapons of war here in Hampton Roads from my colleagues during the course of this panel. But for my part, I'll spend most of my time in the water and under it. While the Battle of Hampton Roads was important, the battle I'll be focusing on is the battle with the water, the battle to salvage the vessels that were victims of war and were obstructions to both war and peace. I will focus much of my presentation today on USS Merrimack and her later incarnation, CSS Virginia. Now, a note on the name Merrimack. Old habits died hard, and the overwhelming favorite name for the ironclad ship throughout the 19th century was Merrimack, no matter what side you were on. So because of the sources, I will use the names interchangeably today. But yes, for the ironclad, Virginia was her name. Not Merrimack, wrote Confederate Colonel Charles Norris. In Virginia, of Virginia iron and wood, and by Virginians was she built, and in Virginia's waters, now made classic by her exploits, she made a record which shall live forever. And judging by how many decades it took to substantially salvage her post-war, it probably felt like she would lie in her watery grave forever as well. To set the stage for her first demise, I'll remind you that in April 1861, the steam screw frigate Merrimack was in ordinary at Gosport Navy Yard. At that same time, Virginians were split, politically and ideologically, over the issue of secession. But when Lincoln called for volunteers to fight their Southern brethren, many in Virginia felt they had to take a stand. On April 17, 1861, the Virginia legislature voted for secession. This had been anticipated by Gideon Welles, Secretary of U.S. Navy, and plans were already underway to remove valuable ships and war material from Gosport Navy Yard in Portsmouth, Virginia. However, mixed messaging received by Yard Commandant Charles Stewart Macaulay resulted in very little being removed by the time that Virginia Governor John Letcher ordered Major General William Booth Tolliver of the Virginia Militia to Norfolk to occupy Gosport Navy Yard. Citizens in Norfolk and Portsmouth quickly created an impromptu vigilance committee and began placing disruptions to navigation off Sewell's Point to hinder Union access into and out of Gosport Navy Yard. Other citizens created a ruse to make Macaulay believe that vast numbers of troops were arriving by train, running the same train back and forth with the same men on board, arriving noisily again and again to make Macaulay believe vast numbers of armed men were massing outside of the yard. Macaulay ordered the abandonment of Gosport Navy Yard by U.S. Navy personnel, which culminated in the burning of the yard and the ships there on April 20th. Only the sloop of war Cumberland was successfully removed by U.S. Navy personnel on the 20th, though that was hampered by the obstructions placed by the Virginians, with the Cumberland briefly dragging one of the sunken vessels as she made her successful escape. While Union forces attempted a thorough destruction, they left much of the yard damaged, but it was still usable for the Virginians. Both the Union and Confederacy had contributed to the chaos left behind in the Elizabeth River. The ruins of the Germantown, Plymouth, Pennsylvania, Raritan, Columbia, Delaware, Dauphin, United States, and Merrimack were obstructions to navigation, to be sure, but they also were, or they contained, valuable war material. The immediate problem for the Virginians to solve was how to raise them, and the other small vessels likewise destroyed, and who would do it. Joseph Pierce, formerly the master ship's carpenter at the yard, who had resigned his commission to remain with the Virginia Navy, used what means he had available to him at the yard to begin the work. He and his men pumped out the United States and began raising guns, shot, and gunpowder from the sunken vessels, using divers and diving bells. But it was clear that a larger effort overall would be needed at the yard. Fortunately for Pierce, as well as the nascent Virginia State Navy, a local firm had the resources and expertise to raise all the vessels and ordnance in the yard. That firm was B&J Baker and Company, then located at Baker's Wharf in Portsmouth, Virginia, right next to the Navy Yard. Books about the early days of the war occasionally mention the firm, though just as often it remains nameless. Most modern books on the CSS Virginia or the Battle of Hampton Roads give the Bakers a sentence, if anything at all, in part because the primary sources are so often devoid of description. Older volumes are a little more chatty. John Porter, in his Record of Events in Norfolk County, Virginia, stated that the sunken vessels Merrimack, Plymouth, Germantown, and Dauphin, which were lying alongside the wharves at the Navy Yard, were gotten up by the Baker Wrecking Company under direction of the Confederate authorities to get them out of the way. He mentions that these authorities thought that some of these vessels were salvageable, and thus some work was commenced on the last three with a view to fitting them out. The Merrimac was burned down to her waterline and was not thought any use could be made of her beyond taking her machinery out of her, but subsequent events proved the fallacy of human predictions, for the stone which the builders rejected became the keystone of the temple. The Bakers would be the ones who delivered that keystone to the Confederate Navy. So, who were those skillful artisans touted in Confederate-leaning papers as the celebrated wreckers, the Bakers, who expeditiously and faithfully raised the ships at Gosport? Well, they were the Baker brothers, Barnabas and Joseph seen here, the first professional wreckers to open a salvage wrecking business in the Chesapeake Bay region beginning in the 1840s. For a time, they were the only professional wrecking business south of New York and north of the Florida Keys. The Bakers and their associates were instrumental in helping the Confederacy transform the destruction of Gosport Navy Yard into a growing naval threat to the Union. The assumption of most writers, therefore, has been tacitly or overtly that the Bakers were loyal Confederates, and there are compelling reasons to make this assumption. In the days following the secession of Virginia and the burning of Gosport, many within the Union considered all citizens of Norfolk and environs to be suspect, and the Bakers and their associates were no exceptions. Deeper analysis shows, however, that the Bakers were by no means Confederate sympathizers. In fact, the Bakers and most of their closest associates were all from the Northeast United States and were staunchly pro-Union. Of the raising of the ships at Gosport, it was known locally that these Cape Codmen were forced to accept the work and perform it, using for it their wrecking apparatus. Unable to leave Hampton Roads because of their expertise and their value to the Confederacy, they found themselves faced with some difficult choices. Barnabas and Joseph were unable to leave and likely hesitated to risk all they had worked for to try to make a dangerous escape. Thus, the Bakers and their crew found themselves trapped in Portsmouth, where the Virginia State Navy deemed their equipment and skills extremely useful. The Bakers, situated as they were right next to the Navy Yard, as well as in possession of the means to raise all of the ships and guns, were quickly pressed into service by the Virginia State Navy. But the Navy made it worth their while. French Forrest, now in command of the Navy Yard, issued a contract to the Bakers for raising the vessels. Though not sympathetic, had the Bakers not signed the contract, they would likely have found that all doors in town were shut to them, including access to basics like food and other life-sustaining supplies. The Bakers would receive $5,000 to raise the two sloops of war, Germantown and Plymouth. But the Merrimac, she was considerably larger, and she commanded a larger price. The contract for raising her hulk, dated May 18, 1861, guaranteed the Bakers $10,000 for a successful lift, which they did on May 30th, 1861. The newspapers wrote, "The celebrated wreckers, the Bakers. Yesterday morning at 5 o'clock, 4 steam pumps were put in motion, the holes battened and leaks having been previously stopped, and indeed every preparation made preparatory to the operation of pumping. The 4 pumps discharged 160 barrels of water each minute, or 40 barrels each. At 6 o'clock yesterday afternoon, I went on board the raised steamer. She was alongside the wharf at the Navy Yard. They had then, as Baker told me, discharged 12.5 feet of water. There were about 6 feet in the hold. She was up 9 or 10 feet out from the surface of the water. Her water pipes had been cut, and the magazine cock was found turned so as to let in the stream. This Baker turned so as to shut off the influx. The damage to the engine is not of a serious character. I learned that it is not improbable the Merrimac may be taken into the dry dock today." It was not improbable. French Forrest reported to Robert E. Lee that "we have the Merrimac up and just putting her in the dry dock." Though the occasion was momentous for the Confederacy, raising the Merrimac as well as the other vessels at Gosport was not an unusual task for the Bakers, and was also not the only job they had. Other members of their crew worked other wrecks near Hampton Roads, contriving to get captured by the Union to effect their escape north. One such was Eben Stoddard, who is pictured here. He promptly went north and volunteered with the Union Navy on Kearsarge. So, one of the men who helped raise the Merrimac helped take down the Alabama. But that's a story for another day. Now, these jobs were not without their hazards, however. In June, a melancholy accident occurred at the Navy Yard. To wit, Mr. David Williams descended to the bottom of the river by means of a diving apparatus to stop the holes by which the sloop of war Plymouth had been scuttled in April. While thus engaged, it appeared that the cap connected with the diving bell separated, and he was drowned before the usual time of making the signal to draw him up. It became necessary then to pull him up with grappling irons, and when raised to the surface of the water, it was found that life was entirely extinct. Over the course of 1861 and into 1862, the Confederacy worked tirelessly in Portsmouth to convert the hull of the Merrimac into an ironclad vessel. While imperfect, the erstwhile Merrimac would prove a deadly concern when she entered Hampton Roads on her maiden voyage on the 8th of March of 1862. In the space of a few short hours, she destroyed Cumberland, set fire to the surrendered Congress, and visited upon the U.S. Navy its worst defeat until Pearl Harbor in 1941. The following day, Virginia met Union ironclad Monitor in battle, which, though a draw, ushered in a new age of naval warfare. Following the Battle of Hampton Roads, President Lincoln became anxious for General McClellan to do something, anything, but McClellan, the original Virginia creeper, had still not executed his peninsular plan by the beginning of May. Lincoln traveled personally to Hampton Roads to force his hand. And so, on the morning of May 10, 1862, Union forces landed on the shore and began moving inland towards Norfolk. By 5 p.m., they had reached downtown. A principal objective for the Confederates in advance of this was to destroy the Navy Yard, and in an eerie replay of the events of April 20th, 1861, flames once again engulfed Gosport, this time set by Confederate hands. In the frantic rush, no one informed Commander Josiah Tatnall, now in command of the CSS Virginia, that Norfolk had fallen earlier than anticipated. Virginia was now without a home, and Tatnall was faced with a dilemma. If he attempted to attack the Union fleet, he had some hope of destroying several vessels before being sunk, or worse, captured. Making a run for the open waters of the bay was impossible because the only channel deep enough for his vessel's deep draft ran directly between the massive guns of Fortress Monroe and the Rip Raps. Some officers reportedly suggested that they abandon her to the enemy, wait for the celebration they knew would come, and then sink the ram with the carousing Union sailors on board. However, the only viable option was to lighten the vessel's load enough to allow her to pass over the James River bar and thus allow her to steam to Richmond for that city's defense. However, with a shift in the wind at midnight, the Virginia's pilots opined that the westerly wind would drive the tide out more and the vessel would never get past the James River bar. Only one course of action remained. Just as she had been destroyed to keep her from enemy hands a little over a year before, now the vessel faced destruction by her own men once again. At 2 a.m., the call was given for the Virginia crew to splice the main brace, and then Tatnall ordered the vessel run aground at Craney Island and the men told to evacuate. A small detachment rigged the vessel to explode and set her ablaze. Richard Curtis, who had once manned one of the Virginia guns, recalled, "Thus the finest fighting ship that ever floated on American waters at that time came to an untimely end at the hands of her friends with no enemy within." On the way up the Elizabeth River the following morning, the Monitor crew got their first glimpse of what was left of Virginia, and several collected souvenirs to send home. By early June 1862, it was clear that the ruins of Virginia were a menace to navigation. Major General John Wool of the U.S. Army took it upon himself to advertise for a firm to remove the wreck from the channel. Flag Officer Goldsborough of U.S. Navy begged to differ, and a testy exchange developed between them. Wool writing to Goldsborough, "Sir, before the property belonged to the Navy was ordered to be turned over to the Navy agents, I made a contract to raise the Merrimac. The contractor had already commenced when you gave orders to those engaged in it to not interfere with the raising. This vessel does not belong to the Navy, she being entirely remodeled and ironclad at the time of her destruction." Goldsborough writes back, "Sir, in reply to your communication of today, I have to say that, from the instructions I have received, I cannot permit anyone to raise the Merrimac under any contract made by you. That wreck is placed distinctly under my charge by the Navy Department, and as to your statement about her not belonging to the Navy, I differ with you entirely in opinion." Well, nevertheless, the work had to be done. So, in June, the Senate appropriated $100,000 for raising sunken vessels for the Navy in Hampton Roads. Under this bill, the Cumberland and Congress were going to be raised, and an attempt would be made at the Merrimac. And so they took bids on this particular RFP. Captain Thomas Wells of Boston, Massachusetts was the winning bid. With 20 divers, 300 men, and 4 whale ships, he came to Hampton Roads in September of 1862. Now you may ask, why not the Bakers? They're local. Well, it's not entirely clear, but there did appear to be some lingering suspicion of them within certain portions of the Navy, despite their proven pro-Union stance. After all, they did raise the Merrimack for the Confederacy, but they were not among the bidders. They were currently working for the Army Corps of Engineers, clearing obstructions in the James River as well as the North Carolina Sounds. But Wells, he had an ambitious piece of work ahead of him. He claimed that he would be able to raise the Cumberland whole, what was left of the Congress, and would be able to bring up what was left of the Merrimack. He would recover any bodies found free of charge and return all private property free of charge and deliver everything to the Navy Yard to be appraised. He further says that he will raise all sunken vessels from Fortress Monroe to Norfolk. That was quite a high charge there. Wells, with his hundreds of men, his divers, his multiple ships, yes, they were successful in some regards, having cleared some parts of the wrecks from the yard. But despite his divers giving a rosy analysis of the Cumberland and Merrimack's hulls, those vessels stayed put. Wells expended close to $70,000 on the attempt, and the Navy had very little to show for it. In fact, attempts carried on in the later years of the war, and the need to remove the wreck of the Merrimack took on increasing urgency, particularly when it embarrassed certain members of the armed forces. In January of 1864, Major General Benjamin Butler left Hampton Roads for Washington on the steamer City of Hudson, but the steamer ran upon the wreck of the Merrimack in a heavy fog and sustained some serious injury. Now, the passengers and Butler were safe, and they were taken off by the steamer Mount Washington, but this was definitely something that drew attention once again, and by February, the Navy was once more soliciting for new proposals. This time, they added the phrase, "No wreck will be considered removed while any portion of keel or floor timbers remain." And finally, there came a wrecker with as much determination as he had time, David Underdown of Norfolk. Now, by August of 1865, Underdown and his crew had actually worked underwater on the hull of Congress and were able to pump out the sealed hull and raise what was left of that ship using steam-powered derricks to lift her, towing her first to Ferry Flats off Berkeley before bringing her to the yard. By December of 1865, Underdown raised a large portion of the ironclad Merrimack, as the papers called her, including the composition wheel of 9 tons and 15 feet of the stern and a section of the shaft. He did so by essentially building a cofferdam around the wreck and used steam pumps to force the water out. But the hull proved too large for this effort, and only portions of it were removed in this matter. But the wreck was still a menace, sinking the steamer Adelaide of the Baltimore Steam Packet Company's Old Bay Line in December of 1866. Everyone was rescued from that wreck by, well, the Baker brothers. Now, in 1867, Underdown brought up the boilers of the vessel of Virginia, and also the prow, which he put on sale, as you can see in this 1867 ad. He brings up the anchor in November of 1868, but sadly, he dies of a stroke that December, having lost more money than he ever made on the contract. After a point, you see, it had become a matter of pride with him. John Hebrew took a contract in 1871, but had little success. And finally, in 1874, the Bakers stepped back in, both in their own capacity as a company and as a rental agency of wrecking vessels and equipment to fellow wreckers and divers in the region. You see, they could afford to ignore all the calls for raising the Merrimack. They now had a business that stretched far beyond the waters of Hampton Roads at this point. But they did take a bite at it. As you can see here, the old Merrimack, sunk just above Criney Island, has been recommenced, and the wrecking firm of B&J Baker & Company has the matter in hand. There have been many bites made at this cherry, but we imagine that a clean sweep will be made this time, as this firm is not in the habit of doing things by halves. Well, bite at it then as all they might. Unfortunately, they were not able to get everything, although they did bring up a fair portion of pieces from the wreck, including the rest of the shaft, weighing 10 tons. Other diving concerns focused on the Cumberland in the 1870s, but silt hampered any major work and the depth made her less of an obstruction concern. Most effort was focused on recovering the safe from the ship, whose contents grew more and more valuable with each newspaper article. Ultimately, it was stated that more money had gone into the safe recovery than was in the safe. In 1875, they're still blowing up the Merrimack. In fact, she'll be blown up at least 3 more times before the end of our story. The well-known diver of Portsmouth, Mr. William West, he is now taking over, and he is renting some of the Baker's equipment. And he blows her up and pulls things up as he can. The last major salvage effort, though, was in 1876. And here you can see the remains of the celebrated Confederate ironclad Merrimack were towed to the Navy Yard yesterday morning by the tugboats Nettie, a Baker tugboat, and Edwin Ludlow. 4 large pontoons, yes, owned by the Bakers, were used, and they were brought. The vessel was brought to the yard. And here you can see in the log for dry dock number 1 at Gosport Navy Yard that she was to be cut up. People were invited to take souvenirs. Now today you can no longer try to salvage the Virginia. Craney Island is now both a wildlife refuge and an industrial area, which has been used as a location for placement of dredge materials since 1957 and is operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. What little material is left is likely covered in fill, and the rumored boilers of the Merrimack, which had been reported in the early 2000s, are the wrong shape, though what has been seen could be one of the lost pontoons used by the Bakers in their 1874 attempts. But the Virginia lives on in museums around the region. Her wheel and her napkin rings can be seen at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, her bell at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum in Norfolk, her anchor and shaft at the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, and other souvenirs and parts are spread out across the nation, from tiny relics taken by the Monitor Boys in 1862 to the tourist scavengers at the yard in the 1870s, or the souvenirs from her iron made during the 1907 Jamestown Exposition. She was a technological wonder herself, and all methods of 19th century salvage and diving technology were used to remove her from her watery grave. Thank you. I look forward to any questions you might have.